Welcome back to Savage Fabrication Insta-Spool Performance. This is the last video, I think, for now, on the VE injection pump. In the previous video, we went heavily over how the inside of the VE injection pump works. So how it creates case pressure, how case pressure is managed, how the pumping mechanism works inside of the distributor housing, and how the plunger system and Spillport Collar and all that stuff works. So you can really get an idea in your mind about how much time we have to get an injection event to happen while the engine is moving. To put things into perspective, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and something that was mentioned was that at 6,000, I know we spin 3,000 RPMs, but at 6,000 RPMs engine speed, the crank rotates 720 degrees in 20 microseconds. If we want to figure out what that is at 3,000, essentially at 3,000 RPMs, it's going to rotate 360 degrees in probably the same 20 microseconds. I don't think we go up to 40 microseconds. It is still unbelievably fast. It's not even at 1 second, which is hard for a lot of us to even conceptualize. So in this one, we're going to go over a hot rod pump. Basically, this is like as good as it gets for street driving, and then everything is going to be less than this if it's stock, even if it's turned up stock. Yes, some people do get lucky with a factory calibration just working out for them, but the majority of VE pump owners are not going to have that same luck, and it's good to understand this stuff so when you do get your dyno sheet or you see your track time, you're not upset. We were just at the Golden State Diesel Fest. There's two first gens there drag racing, and one did run the dyno, made like 3:11 at the tire, and the track time I think was right around 18 seconds, and the other one was 21 seconds, something like that. So just because they sound really crazy and there's all this boost pressure and noise going on does not mean that they're making a lot of power, because as we've talked about in our previous videos, the horsepower comes from the fuel that we can put in the chamber. And on top of how much fuel we can put in the chamber, when it comes especially to diesel, it's how efficiently we utilize that fuel and turn it into pressure at the right point in crank angle to make the power with it. So if we make cylinder pressure too late, the piston's starting to accelerate and run away from the expansion event, as well as the volume of the chamber is growing pretty fast, so the rate at which that expansion event is applying pressure to the piston decreases really fast. And if we're too early, basically our crank pin and connecting rod piston pin, top con rod pin, is too straight up and down for that pressure to be applied to really do much of anything. So there's a really good optimal window that we want that to be in, and that's for any piston engine. It's 15 degrees to 45 degrees after top dead center. So it's not too far, that's not a big window. So it's important that we get our tuning right. So the first thing that we want to look at is kind of the curve. If we look at the curve, what we kind of see is from off idle, we get this really big spike up in fuel delivery to 1600 to 2200. So from off idle to this, we get this really steep delivery curve. And then once we hit 2200 and go to 2500, we lose some. 3000, we lose some. 3600, we lose some, and so on, until we're not putting enough fuel in the chamber to make enough horsepower to continue to accelerate anymore. So typically, one of the worst things you can do for a VE setup is put anything that spools slow on it, S400s or T4 S300s. Those things aren't going to come up to their peak pressure to make any kind of power until they're in about this RPM right here, between the 3,000 and 2,500. And especially the S400s can be even worse than that. They can be in this area. So we can have 60 pounds of boost by 2,500 RPMs, but if it took us that long to get the 50, 60 pounds of boost at 2,500, that means that we're missing out on this number right here, this 310 cc's, which 310 cc's is more than 290 cc's. If this was a more OEM pump that was modded, it could be the same thing. At 1,600, 2,200, we could have 250 cc's. At 2,500, we can have 230 to 220 cc's. So no matter what, we're going to have this same curve where it comes up real steep down low and then starts to fall as RPM comes up. So trying to make a lot of boost pressure too far out, it might sound really cool, make a lot of air whistly noises, but if you ever put it on a chassis dyno, try to go down the pole track, or went down a drag strip, your times and your dyno sheet, or distance pulled, or where you place in the class, are going to represent very clearly what's going on with the fuel injection pump curve. Because it's a mechanical pump, you like to think of it as the engine is the guy turning the crank on the mechanical pump. The faster you turn it, the more cc's you get. Well, there's also a limit to how much of more you can get. In this case, the more we can get is at 2200 and 310. And when we go from 2200 to 2500, we go from 310 to 290, 2500 to 3000, 270, and so on. We see that keeps continuing to go down. One thing that the VE pumps are really good about, because they have really, really short duration, 2.4 millimeters of cam lift. So because that duration is really short, they tend to be even poorly tuned or with less expensive injectors still do pretty well in the brake specific. We have a whole video on the brake specific. We will lightly kind of go over it here, but if you want to understand it better, we do have a video that you can go check out on our channel that talks all about brake specific fuel consumption and how to apply it. So a stock first gen on the data plate comes out to a 0.43 brake specific fuel consumption ratio. It's actually pretty decent. I think a PC100 is actually a little bit lower than that, but it's probably because of injection pressure and a few other things. But what is really interesting, that is, once we start cranking these things up, whereas with a P pump or common rail, it's really easy to make this number go up. On a VE, we actually tend to see the number go down. So if we were to make sense of a lot of the horsepower numbers from VEs out there and be realistic in this world that we're in, we'd have to say that brake specific is going down with these bigger injectors and the dynamic timing advance. And this is brake specific at horsepower, not brake specific at peak torque. So what is pretty common is to see about a 0.36 brake specific to 0.3. Now 0.3 is much more rare, 0.36 is much more common. It is Witch Hunter has the CC conversion. So what we're going to do is take our 310 times 6. So that is 1860 cc's. It's 177. Should have done this before. So that's 177.1 pounds hour of fuel. At 1740 cc's, that's 290 times 6. We have 290 cc's of delivery valve or a cylinder, and we have 6 of those. So that's 165. Man, that bird. He's having time trying to stand on the slanted roof. We're going to get 270. 270 times 6, no, 27. 1620. $154.3 and 260. 1560. $148.6. Okay, now we have all those numbers. One thing that I've also noticed with the VE pumps on the dyno is that they don't tend to, it's both VEs and VPs, and I think that this really has to do with the length of the injection event, so that 2.4 millimeters of lift. They do not lose, if any, we can't measure it at least cc's through the injector. They do, but it seems to be a very small amount with a 2.4 millimeter lift, or on a VP, 3.6 millimeters of lift, versus a P pump that has a 12 millimeter lift. So the plunger injects for 12 millimeters of cam rise, where with the VE it injects for 2.4 millimeters of cam rise. On the P700 we tend to average about a 90 cc loss total, so like a 390 cc pump. If we want to do all the math and it match what we're seeing on the dyno, we would actually calculate it at 300 cc's, but when we do this with a VE or a VP, they tend to actually line up right where they should be with the printout that we get for the injection pump. Just wanted to note that, just so if someone is looking at a VE pump and they say it only flows 310 cc's, and then they try to use our math and pull 90 out, it looks kind of bad. But the VEs and the VPs with that really short duration do not seem to have an amount lost that's so great that it affects power like the P pumps do with their really long duration event. So we can see where the brake specific gets really important, because 177.1 divided by 0.43 only comes out to, this would come out to 411 wheel horsepower is what we'd expect to see. If we got the tune-up right, so we advanced the timing, or say we had like a too small of injector and that's making it a longer than necessary duration event, or just went with a better quality set of injectors and say we dropped that to 0.36. 177.1 divided by 0.36. Just by doing that, we went from 411 to 491.9 wheel horsepower. So we've picked up almost 100 horsepower just by making the combustion event more efficient. And it's not really hard to do. A lot of this stuff can be done without even buying anything. It just has to do with rotating the pump and the bore to advance or retard the timing if it's too high or too low. The other thing that'll help with brake specific is a lot of boost pressure. Boost pressure helps the flame speed pick up. It does take a lot. It's not a linear uptake on what we get, so we don't really see like big gains until around 47 to 55 psi. We'll start to see a drop in brake specific, and then it'll stay about the same all the way up to about 110, 120 pounds of boost. At that point, we'll usually see another drop in the brake specific consumed to make the same amount of horsepower. So it does take a pretty good jump. So we're not going to see a drop in brake specific going from like 20 to 40, but we would see a drop going from 20 to 50 to 60. And then we won't see a drop going from like 60, 70, 80, 90. It'll run about the same. And then once we get past that 90 into about the 110, 120 area, we'll see another drop in brake specific. I think that it has to do with the amount of pressure that's being basically being filled in the cylinder, and as long with the oxygen content, as long as the density is right, the density ratio is right, oxygen content's going up. And the other thing you do is just spray with nitrous. Be careful about how you spray with nitrous, but nitrous will lower brake specific regardless of whether it tunes good or not. The next thing that we can get into is, what does Brad think that Scheid, THD, and the other guys are doing to get these CCs out of these pumps? Ooh, tinfoil hat time, as everybody's been hearing everybody say a lot. So what we have going on here, this is just a single slotted plunger. If I was to draw every single one, which I'm not that great of an artist, and I got a really fat tip pen. Here is a frontal view of what this would look like with all the things on it. These voids here are the feed voids. This is the hole that feeds from the pressurized area that's in the front, in this area here. As this travels forward while it's rotating, it creates pressure in this cavity, and once it uncovers a hole, that'll be right there. Once that hole is uncovered, injection begins, because it allows it to flow through here, flow through the slot, and to the delivery valve area, which then feeds our injector. One thing that we do know, and that is not secretive at all, is that a non-intercooled VE pump flows more than an intercooled VE pump. They both have the same cam plate. They both, that I know of, have the same case pressure. But what a non-intercooled VE pump has is a wider slot on the plunger. It's probably, of quote me on the number, it's probably about 20 to 30% bigger as far as the width goes than what a intercooled one is. I don't know why Chrysler did this or Bosch did this. They both come from the factory at the same flywheel horsepower. Maybe they said that the bigger slot took more machine time, and to keep up with demand by making the slot smaller, that was a couple less passes they had to make on the CNC machine, and it still created the same flywheel horsepower. I'm not sure, but one of the things that we can infer from this change is that when they did go to the intercooled VE pump, they did lose the maximum amount of fuel that you could crank these things up to. By making the slot wider, in time, the feed slot to the, like we talked about in the last video, is uncovered for a longer amount of time, meaning more of the fuel can get through the delivery valve. It is directional. One thing that I've been thinking about is that I'm not sure if these companies are just making the slot even wider. The issue with that is you are kind of playing with being able to hold pressure in the line for a long enough duration. So one of the things that I was kind of thinking is that they might, let's go back to what it would normally be here. So if this is a normal one, one of the things that they might be doing, the direction of rotation is this way. One of the things they could be doing is just making one side of the slot wider and leaving the other one alone. By leaving the other one alone, the plunger still has the ability during rotation to get up to the pressure that it needs to get to, but because the following shoulder has been shifted over, it can, through its rotational movement and directional movement, continue to pump fuel through the feed orifice for a longer duration. This is one of the things that is probably also verified through doing a 4mm cam plate. The 4mm cam plate tends to not really offer much of anything other than heat on a 12mm and 14mm pump. And this is probably due to, if you add more this way, but the amount of the RPM of the pump still stays the same, it might push farther, but if it pushes farther for longer, we also might be pushing farther for longer, and we still might be on the push stroke during the port to the delivery valve being covered up, which doesn't do a whole lot of anything and might contribute to why these things tend to get hot and overheat. The 14mm cam plate might be actually viable with modifications done to the plunger's slot. One reason, like stated, would be making the following edge wider and leaving the nose side alone. Or, if it's an intercooled pump, making the leading edge the same size that is a non-intercooled pump, but modifying the following edge to be further back. So the amount of time during the lift stroke that it can feed fuel through that port is fixed. If this was to cause issues, one of the other ideas that I had that they may be doing is doing a chamfer on the top. Now the chamfer on the top, probably should just draw this really big. If you were to look at these slots here, but make them larger, if this is our slot, and this is the feed port, one of the things that they might be doing is coming in and chamfering this edge, beveling it. This would do two things. First thing that it would do is, as this is uncovered, the area, if we were to measure flow area through here, would grow at a faster rate over time of rotation. Just like when you look at valve jobs in your head, there are certain valve seat angles that on paper, it's one of those things where people say it works and other people don't say it works, but if we look at it on paper, you can do certain valve jobs to two valve heads to make them near the curtain area of a 4-valve head through the valve angle. And how you do that would be this here. So as this uncovers, it actually uncovers at a faster rate over time. So we could start injecting sooner and have this open longer at the end of the event. It would be uncovered for a longer amount of time. So even as this is traveling this direction, we could still have fuel feeding into the feed port while this whole thing is still traveling forward. For all this to work, we would want, this is the stuff that they know is probably truly trial and error. I don't think, at least maybe with the pump bench stands, you can see this, but I don't know how many of them are monitoring the pressure in front of the plunger and using that versus just ordering in plungers and doing different cuts to find out what works and what doesn't. So those are probably the main things that I think that they're doing. I really don't think a lot of it has to do with the cam plate, or if it is a cam plate, it's going to be in addition to some sort of mod in the plunger itself. You may be able to do the same thing in the distributor head by machining the distributor port a certain way, but that distributor head is mighty complicated with all of its many passages and everything else. From a builder standpoint, it would probably be a lot easier to put this in a CNC machine or manual machine and do the modifications there than trying to go in and re-engineer their distributor head. You can yield the same result while doing the same thing. For all this to work, there's a collar that we talked about, basically the Spillport Collar. I don't think they're doing anything with the Spillport Collar. I thought about if it could be the Spillport Collar or not. They could be machining the Spillport Collar to hold the spill port covered up for a longer duration, but realistically we can basically do the same thing through the fuel metering screw, and we all know that there's usually enough fuel metering screw in most of these to get them to run away. So lengthening or shortening the fuel metering collar doesn't seem to really go anywhere. If we shortened it and then pulled it farther, we still kind of end up at the same spot as if we lengthened it to draw it farther. If we lengthened it and then released it, it's still covering that much farther forward. Mechanically, it can only travel so far. It's kind of like it'd be like changing the connecting rod length without changing the crank throw. You just have to change where the pin is in the piston, and it still ends up traveling the same distance. You just change the angles a little bit of the system. So where I think a lot of the magic is happening is modification of the plunger itself. So I think that covers just about everything. I guess we can go over like turbos. We went over Brad's tinfoil hat ideas on how they're modifying the VEs to get more fuel out of them. 14 millimeter seems to kind of be a thing of the past at the moment. They're moving more, I guess we're not moving more CCs than the 14 mil, but they are moving very close to it more reliably. So instead of, Jason Sands 14 mils, 370 cc's, and THD's 12 mils, 310. 60 cc's is definitely a lot of power potential there. But on the other side of the things, these should last just as long as the factory one, whereas the 14 mils, kind of, we never know when they're going to die. Turbos. You need turbos that spool as fast as possible. The problem with that is a lot of turbos that spool really fast have a really low choke value in RPM. So like a lot of the fastest spooling stuff out there, if you're to look at it, they'll go in a choke flow of about 2,500, which means after 2,500, the volumetric efficiency of the engine is falling. But then we can look at compounds. Compound turbos, you can have the best of both worlds through using a wastegate on the manifold and two small compounds. So like an S200, S300, a Super B basic with an S300, a K27 with an S300, a Savage Fabrication Superhero turbocharger paired with an S300. The atmospheric turbo, we probably go with like a 110 housing T4 on the S300. That way, because we know that the 93 housings still seem to hit like a choke value between 25 to 2,700 RPMs. So we still probably go with 110, just because we know we're going to get it online no problem with the manifold turbocharger. So we want like the manifold turbo to come on really fast, and then we want to gate around that because the manifold turbo tends to have a lower choke value. we would want to gate around it to move the choke value up to the 110 housing, to that 3,000 to 3,500 area, and this would make a really stellar truck. So we would still have a falling horsepower. Now we would get up and burn everything here. We would make our 500 wheel horsepower, then from 500 wheel horsepower at 2,200, at 2,500 we might have, be down at like 460, 480 or what, we didn't get that far in the math, I don't want to bore you guys. But we'd just see the horsepower start to fall down. But we would have a much more enjoyable truck. It would be thrown down 9 grass that we want. It would burn very clean, because if we dump all the fuel in with a turbo that spools over here, it's just going to be a dirty hot mess. Versus doing all quick spooling stuff, it'll be a world of a difference better. Big like S475 T6, there is absolutely no reason to have that in a compound kit on a VE truck. That's why we kind of look at it. 310 cc's at a 0.36, that's 500 wheel horsepower. The atmospheric turbo just needs to be able to support what 500 horsepower is worth of, and if we want an air over the top of that, we're just going to take we would just bump it up like another 30%. So if 500 divided by 8, that's 62.5 pounds a minute. So we'll probably look for a turbo that flows around 80 pounds a minute. Because we can increase the boost pressure, make the engine pull in 80 pounds a minute, but only put in the fuel for 500 wheel, and now we're doing 500 wheel with a 25 to 1 AFR. So the thing's going to run cool, do a 100% duty cycle, and now the issue is the radiator, fan, and everything else, because it's not going to be able to keep up with putting 500 horsepower worth of heat into that cooling system. But I think we just about went over everything. I can't really think of anything else. We went over turbochargers, K27, the HX Superhero series being the 60-67-9 is going to fit really well. If you want to rev the thing between 3,000 and 3,600, it's going to be 62 or 67. Where you will probably make less horsepower on the 67 than with the 62, just because it's going to push spool up into this area here with the big compressor, versus run the smaller compressor stuff, which is going to get up on boost, 40 pounds of boost by this 60 and 2200 area, and we'll have 50 no problem by 2300, 2400 RPMs. The K27 has about a limit right here, about 2500. That's where the atmospheric turbo comes in. The Super 960 runs up to about 2750, so in between these two, before we run out of compressor flow on that one. So again, that's why we have the atmospheric turbocharger, because we want to take the atmospheric capacity limit off the manifold unit and give it to the atmospheric unit. So we would pick like an S366 that can safely flow 80 pounds a minute, no problem, 66 or 69, with a 110 T4 housing. So things all come up, basically they should just about come up together, and we gate around the manifold unit to hold it at 40 pounds of boost, and then we get the rest of the boost from the atmospheric unit, because we get more density ratio by getting boost out of the atmospheric unit than we do out of the manifold unit. I think that about covers it. I went over my crazy ideas, we went over turbochargers, went over how it works, went over all kinds of little tips and tricks on how to blow your engine up and ruin your injection pump if you're not careful. THD and Scheid are realistically the only ones that I know of. I think Northeast Diesel also does VE pumps, but I do not know how much they flow or what they can get out of them. THD and Scheid are both putting out the same horsepower numbers on their built 12 mils. 4mm cam plates create a lot of heat, probably because of the rotor design. As the rotor design changes, the 4mm cam plate probably works a lot better. Talked about the crazy ideas and why I validate or believe in the crazy ideas to be working, and then financially why they seem more viable than other ones. So I think that covers it. Not too long of a video, real short. The next series is going to be on P7100, so that's going to be really fun. We might actually pull a P7100 apart for you guys. We have one that seized a barrel and plunger assembly. It's a 160 pump. It's literally going to cost, it would probably cost, I would imagine, $2 to $4 grand just to make it into something decent, we ended up better off buying a used built 12 millimeter pump for the truck instead. It's just the factory plunger size is 12 millimeter, but it's a 180 pump built by a shop that should flow enough for 500 to 600 at the tire. That's the goal, and that's the truck that we're going to be using for all the dyno videos and tuning and crazy ideas that I have about a lot of things on the internet. We're going to test and see if they work or not, or debunk them by doing the opposite of what they're doing. Should be a lot of fun. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out our website, InstaSpool Performance, for all of your old school diesel truck needs. Realistically, 89 to 02, oil covers, tools, tower deletes if you're going to hang compounds on things, turbochargers, and our really cool shirts. And there are soon to be hats on there. Can't wait to get those on there and start getting them out to everybody. Yeah, thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you know when the next one gets put up. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Now, I guess we could add this in at the end. Stop revving your VEs for horsepower. Look at the curve. The higher you rev it, the less fuel you got. The 4200 spring is in there so it doesn't defuel as bad at 3000 to 3600 with the 3200 spring. Doesn't mean rev it to 4200 RPMs. They're just putting that in there so it doesn't derate you when you're in this range, because 3000 to 3600 is realistic when you're trying to run down a pull track or a drag strip. But on a chassis dyno, if it peaks at 2500, between 2500 and 3000, and it's not the number that you want, don't rev it to 3600 to try and make more horsepower, because your peak torque location dictates how far out peak horsepower will be. So peak horsepower is at 3 or 2700 or 2800. You're not going to make more power revving it higher, because VE falls the farther we get away from peak torque. So peak torque was here. The farther away we get from it, the less VE, volumetric efficient, the engine gets, less air it's consuming. And at the same time of consuming less air, we're also putting less fuel in it. So see this EGTs start to get even hotter and hotter, and horsepower gets lower and lower. And that's just a VE thing. That's why it's really important why the turbochargers need to be like spot on. It is definitely make or break on a VE truck, whether it's going to make the power that you want to make or not, when it comes to getting the turbos correct. So on top of having to tune it, which they're very forgiving on the tuning, the turbos need to be right. We don't think T6 turbos belong on VE trucks unless you're just doing it to be cool. And T4 S400 singles have no business being on there. A T4 S300 is too big. So the T3 gated on the manifold, get something that you can place your peak torque somewhere. If you don't know where the peak torque's going to be, you can always talk to us. We'll answer it for you. Whether it's on a bar HX Super 9s, or like a K27 with an S300, or like a S200, S300, whatever it is. Don't try and rev the thing out, because especially on a dyno, if you rev it really high up and something lets go, it's really dangerous for everybody. It goes for just anything. It could be a P pump, it could be a common rail. If it peak torques at 2500 and peak horsepower is 2800, there's not going to be any more power made revving it any higher. All you do is blow turbos up and spit drive lines out. So we recommend highly that you don't do it, because one, you might not get to drive the truck home if you try and mat it for the horsepower. That's why we always look at the graph. We do run number 1, we go look at the graph, and like peaks here. Regardless of VE, common rail, P pump, QE, whatever it is, do your first run on the dyno. Look at where peak horsepower and peak torque's at. It's not going to change. The numbers will change, but where the peaks are not going to change as long as it was a decent run. Even if you felt it was a bad run, if the thing was screaming at 40, 50 pounds of boost, then the peaks are at the right spot. They're not going to move. If it peaked at 3, we highly recommend you don't rev to 3600, try and make more horsepower. We all do that, or at least we all try to, because a lot of times we're not happy with the number the dyno gives us. So then we try and rev it higher to get more power out of it. And all we do by revving it higher is increase the likelihood of throwing a driveline out the back of the truck, which can be send people to the hospital, blowing turbochargers up because we overspeed them, and all kinds of other fun stuff, especially if you drove your vehicle to the event and you want to drive it home. Do the first run, look at where the peaks are at, and don't drive it past the peak. If peak was 2800, then make your pull as hard as you absolutely can to 28 to 3000 and get out of it. No need to rev it to 3600. It'll keep your stuff alive, it'll keep your engine happy, it'll keep everybody around you at the event will be happy. Or if you're even out doing testing on the street, it's kind of where you can feel, we call it hitting the wall. So as you're making the pull, it pulls really hard and all of a sudden it starts to get sluggish. And the other way you can see about where peak torque's at is peak torque's going to be where EGTs start to climb fairly regardless of how much boost pressure there is. Obviously you can take a lot of boost out of it and then you can rev it higher, but we're talking if you got 40-50 pounds of boost, there's going to be an RPM where the EGTs just start to get out of control. That tends to be where peak torque is at on the chassis dyno, which is pretty cool. So you can even get your own idea of where it's at just by making passes. If the EGTs get hot at like a really low RPM number, then there's probably something up with the tune. I'm going to keep rambling on forever, so we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.